A few years ago, a group of friends and I went camping in Tachijai during the spring break. It was early May, and the weather was pleasant. I was with 3 friends, so there were 4 of us in total. 3 of them visited this campsite every year, but it was my first time joining them. I had never camped with these guys before, but I was eager to experience it. They convinced me by saying that the beach was stunning and that it was usually empty, so we could do whatever we wanted without anyone disturbing us. After taking the exit off National Route 51 and driving along a narrow road for a few hundred meters, we reached the beach. We saw a family RV right near the entrance, so we decided to set up camp about 200 meters away from them. By lunchtime, the beach was full of surfers, but by evening, they had all left. The beach was now completely empty, stretching out as far as the eye could see, with just the family camper van and us. With no lights around and the silence, I fell asleep faster than usual. We all shared the same tent. 3 of my friends slept side by side, and I was at the bottom, near the zipper, positioned like a dog. I woke up in the middle of the night with a strong urge to pee. I thought I might wet myself. I checked the time on my phone. It was past 2 a.m. I've never been afraid of the dark or superstitious, so I wasn't nervous about the night. I lay there listening to the sound of the waves while I tried to get up, and it was actually quite peaceful. However, I also heard another sound, clear and distinct, which made me freeze in my sleeping bag. The sound was coming from no more than 5 meters away. It was strange and seemed to be getting closer to our tent. The rhythm and interval of the sounds made me instinctively realize they were footsteps. There was no light outside. Walking along a deserted beach without a flashlight? That felt odd. We were far enough from the family RV that they wouldn't have reason to walk near our tent. Besides, I could tell the footsteps were coming from the opposite direction. Could it be a person? The steps were slow and deliberate, almost human-like. My mind raced. I began sweating in the pitch-black tent, too terrified to move. The footsteps circled our tent, sounding like they were right outside, just a few centimeters away. Whatever it was, it walked around the tent in a clockwise direction. What is it doing? I wondered. What should I do? I tried waking one of my friends, but I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. I was too frightened to leave my sleeping bag. I fought the urge to relieve myself and just stayed still, hoping the footsteps would disappear. But things got worse. The footsteps continued, circling our tent. Then something, possibly a hand, occasionally pushed against the fabric of the tent, as if testing for a weak spot to get in. The metal tent poles creaked and bent, making a horrible sound. I tried to think of a song, and I repeated the lyrics in my mind over and over, just telling myself, ignore it, and it'll go away. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would end. Then, suddenly, daylight flooded the tent. I must have drifted off to sleep. Relieved, I rushed outside to use the bathroom, forgetting all about the previous night. When I turned around to look back at the tent, I saw footprints in the sand. The strange thing was the footprints led straight from the sea and back into it. I woke my friends up immediately and told them what had happened. We all decided it was best to leave the beach. The following night, we camped in an area crowded with RVs and other tourists. I work for a nature magazine, where my job involves capturing photographs of wildlife in their natural environments. On a typical workday, I set up my tent along a mountain path and wait for animals to appear. I also use an infrared sensor connected to an automatic shutter to help with my shots. I avoid popular mountain trails because too many people scare the animals away. I've never felt afraid on the job, even though I always work alone in the dark. Until recently, I hadn't encountered any problems. I arrived at a remote location around 1 p.m., an area I had researched beforehand. It was near a swamp. My usual routine is to set up my one-person tent and take a nap until about 5 p.m. Since I camp deep in the mountains, there's no one else around, and it feels safer than the city in many ways. That afternoon, I hung my radio on a tree branch and got into my tent to rest. When I woke up later, it was already dark. I hung my lantern on the branch and started preparing my camera gear. I put on my headlamp and got ready to take some photos. I felt unusually tense and full of anticipation. As I stepped out of my tent, I noticed something odd. About 10 meters upstream from the swamp, I saw a blue tent. That was strange. This wasn't a popular fishing area, but a secluded spot. I didn't think it was a climber or a hiker. I couldn't imagine anyone else being here. There were no lights coming from the tent, so maybe someone was sleeping in it. But I hadn't seen it when I was setting up earlier. Had someone quietly set up camp while I was resting? The lack of noise was unsettling, as I would have expected something to wake me up. I decided to press on and look for a better spot to take pictures. But then, the light inside the blue tent turned on, causing the tent's color to shift to a darker shade. For a moment, I considered going over to introduce myself, but the tent unnerved me, and I quickly dismissed the idea. I didn't want to go near it or deal with whoever might be inside. I needed to move to another location. It would be a hassle, but I couldn't focus with that tent looming in my thoughts. I carefully began to pack up my tent, trying to avoid making any noise and staying out of sight. Once everything was packed, I started walking deeper into the woods, heading uphill alongside the river. I must have walked over a kilometer before I found a good spot and set up camp again, but it was already after 9 p.m., and I knew I wouldn't be able to take photos anymore. I decided to have dinner and try to get some sleep, as there was nothing else to do. It should have been chilly, considering it was mid-May, but I woke up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat inside my sleeping bag. I checked the time, 2 a.m. The air inside my tent felt stale and warm, so I unzipped the flap to let in some cool night air. My heart skipped a beat. The blue tent was now right in front of mine. The light from inside it flickered on once more, and then 2 hands pressed against the fabric, reaching toward me in the dark. For a moment, I was too stunned to move, but then I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the tent. Whatever was inside was now trying to unzip the tent and get out. It must have heard me or seen my light. I took off running, not daring to look behind me. I tripped and fell into the swamp, soaking my legs, but I didn't stop. It was pitch black as I ran, stumbling repeatedly. I lost my flashlight somewhere along the way, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that tent. Eventually, I couldn't run any longer. I collapsed behind a tree, shivering in fear, and waited for daylight. When the sun came up, I gathered the strength to go back to the spot where I had set up my tent, along with the blue tent. I shouted to announce my presence, determined not to be afraid anymore. After spending an entire night in the cold, I was done with the fear. I shouted again, but there was no response. As I approached the tents, I noticed the blue tent seemed more worn out than before. I looked inside my tent, but nothing seemed amiss. However, the people or person who had been in the blue tent had left a strange parting gift, a pile of bones. Some were human, some animal. I couldn't tell for sure. They were crushed together in a heap. That was the last time I ventured on a solo trip so deep into the mountains or woods. This took place in 2011 during a summer fishing trip in a remote area with steep hills and rocky cliffs. It was a place that felt like locals never ventured to, mainly due to the long trek required to get there. The river was known for having large fish, making it a popular spot for those in the know, but it was quite isolated. It was a Saturday, and I expected there to be a few people around, but to my surprise, I was the only one at the river. After setting up my camp and having a nice meal, I relaxed for a while before settling into my sleeping bag inside the tent, ready to get some rest. I had plans to wake up at dawn to fish, I was sleeping soundly when suddenly, a loud noise jolted me awake. I immediately opened my eyes, disoriented, unsure of where I was for a second. I couldn't hear the noise anymore, but the tent was shaking. I glanced at my watch. It was 2 a.m. Still half asleep, I tried to stay calm and composed, telling myself it was probably nothing serious. I wondered if I was just experiencing sleep paralysis, or perhaps an auditory hallucination, but everything felt so real. This wasn't sleep paralysis. I considered that a rock might have fallen from the cliff. I had checked the area before setting up, and there were no loose rocks. The ground was dry and solid, but rocks could still roll down, I thought. I tried not to dwell on the idea of someone being out there in the middle of the night near my tent. That thought was far too unsettling to entertain. I forced myself to calm down, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep after this. I switched on the light in my tent to reassure myself a bit, but I didn't want to leave the safety of the tent just yet. I told myself it would soon be dawn, and I could get up and start fishing. As I was beginning to relax again, I heard something outside. There was a brief silence, followed by a strange, agonizing wail, a groaning sound that made my heart race. I was terrified, my fear almost overwhelming. For a moment, I wondered if it was a person in need of help. Maybe they were injured, so I decided to leave the tent and check. But as I reached for the zipper, the groaning grew louder. I froze. My palms were drenched in cold sweat, and I could make out something outside the tent, a dark figure. I was certain now that someone was out there, and I wasn't about to let them scare me. I grabbed a flashlight and my frying pan, thinking I might need them to defend myself. With shaking hands, I unzipped the tent and cautiously leaned out to look around. The area was empty. I spotted a fishing boat off in the distance, but no one was near my tent. The shadow had vanished, and I could feel the eerie silence hanging in the air. It was unnerving. The tent was lit from the inside by my flashlight, so there shouldn't have been a shadow visible outside. It was a mystery that didn't make sense. I turned on the radio, hoping the voices from the broadcast would help calm my nerves. I sat there, shivering, trying not to dwell on what had just happened. After a while, the DJ's voice began to steady my nerves, and I felt slightly better, but then something horrifying occurred. The top of the tent collapsed with a loud, sickening noise. I knew now for certain that this wasn't just a bad dream. The roof of my tent was crushed, and I felt a sharp pain as it came down. I was overwhelmed with helplessness, and I admit, I broke down in tears. I promised myself that I would leave as soon as the sun came up, no matter what. The sounds outside continued the moaning, and now something that sounded like dragging or crawling. I don't know why, but I turned the radio up to full volume, as though the noise could somehow protect me. When dawn finally came, it was like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I felt a rush of relief as the light of day filled the sky. I stepped outside and took in the surroundings, looking for signs of what had happened. Beer cans, bottles, and flowers were scattered around the camp, but that wasn't what caught my eye. What stopped me in my tracks was the blood smeared on the outside of my tent. I wondered if there had been an accident nearby. Maybe someone had died, and their spirit had lingered around the area. Perhaps that spirit had tormented me throughout the night. Unsure of what to do, I offered what was left of my juice to whatever might be haunting the place, hoping it would bring them peace in the afterlife. I wanted to believe this because the idea of a person or several people tormenting me in the dead of night was far too frightening to face. This took place when I was young, during a family camping trip with some close friends. The campsite was near a large, tranquil lake, nestled in a quiet and remote area. We set up our tents near the water, planning to stay for 2 days. As nightfall arrived, my friends started talking about playing dare games. Our parents overheard and warned us not to try anything risky at night, but Naturally, we didn't listen. The dare was to walk around the lake by yourself in the dark without a flashlight. One of my friends volunteered to go first. We waited quietly as she disappeared into the darkness. She returned after a while, completely unfazed. Next, it was my turn. They encouraged me to go, and though I felt nervous, I couldn't back out. The darkness felt heavy around me, and I grew anxious as I walked, only the sounds of nature accompanying me. Then, I heard footsteps behind me. I braced myself for whoever or whatever was coming. As the figure approached, I recognized one of my parents' friends. He had a flashlight with him, and I felt a wave of relief. He smiled and handed me something. It was a lemon candy, and I thanked him. He told me in a soft voice to be careful. I told him I would eat it later and tucked it into my pocket. His flashlight was pointed at me, but his face remained unclear, hidden by his hood. "Come with me," he said in a strange tone. I replied that I needed to head back to my tent. I thought it was odd, especially since he was always so friendly, and we were having a great time on the trip with our families. Back at the tent, we all decided to sleep. I lay in bed, holding the candy, thinking I'd thank him properly the next day. The morning came, and I approached him as he was sipping his coffee. "Thanks for the candy," I said. He looked puzzled. "Candy? What candy?" he replied, sounding confused. I thought he might be joking, but as the conversation continued, I realized he wasn't. He insisted he hadn't been at the lake the night before. My mom, who had overheard us, came out of the tent and joined the conversation. Things were getting stranger by the second. I went back to my tent and retrieved the candy to show them. All the adults and my friends looked alarmed and unsettled. "Who was that person at the lake?" they asked. I immediately threw the candy away as we hurriedly packed our things. We left the campsite as quickly as we could. This took place when I was in high school. My friends and I went on a camping trip deep in the woods. After finishing dinner, we were cleaning up, joking around, when suddenly, I heard a loud thud. From the looks on my friends' faces, I could tell they had heard it too. It sounded like something had dropped right by our tent. It was dark, so we grabbed flashlights and went to find out what caused it. We found something large and white on the ground, which looked like an animal. We were scared, and we pointed our flashlights at it from a distance. The longer we stared, the more it seemed like a human body. It had pale, balding hair. We cautiously approached, but something felt off. Its limbs were twisted at strange angles. We rushed closer and realized just how serious this was. When we got a better look, we saw that it wasn't a human being, though it was about the size of one. It was a mannequin. Who would throw that at us? We scanned the area with our flashlights, but no one was nearby. We hadn't heard any footsteps or anything when it happened. We had been camping deep in the forest and hadn't seen anyone the entire day. One of our friends volunteered to keep watch while the rest of us packed up quickly. We rushed to leave, abandoning that eerie mannequin lying face down in the dirt. When I was in elementary school, I went on a 2-night camping trip organized by the school during the summer break. The campsite was about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. It was a genuine camping experience. Even though it was technically a campsite, it wasn't very well kept. There was a kitchen and a bathroom, which was a relief since it wasn't just tents. However, the place wasn't in great condition. Everything looked old and worn out. The bathroom was more like an outhouse, to be honest, located far out in a field. The campsite was close to some swampland, and on the other side, there was a steep cliff. Even as a kid, I thought it was a really dangerous place to camp. There were plenty of activities to do, like hiking and fishing during the day, and campfires and dares at night. On the first night, I accepted one of these dares. I thought it would be simple, but it turned out to be different from the usual dares we did. We called them tests of courage, and they weren't usually this intense. This particular dare was created by the teachers, and it went like this. Go into the woods alone at night without a flashlight and stay there for a while. There were rules too. If you screamed or ran, you'd alert the wild animals and become one of the kids who go missing. That's what the teacher said. I understand now that they were just trying to make it fun for us, and I'm sure we were safe, but looking back, it does seem odd. We were told to stand in the woods, in total darkness, and complete silence until one of the teachers came back for us. Even though I didn't really want to do it, I went along with it. I was far from home, far from civilization, and I was an obedient kid, so I followed the teachers with their flashlights into the woods. It was so dark, and all I could hear was the hum of insects and the slow rustle of the trees. We reached the spot, and the teachers turned off their flashlights, and I heard them walk away, stepping over broken branches and through thick bushes. When the flashlights turned off, there was nothing but pure darkness around me. There should have been other kids nearby doing the same dare, but I couldn't hear anyone. I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed. It was that dark. The air felt thick and warm, and it seemed to cling to my skin. I heard some rustling in the bushes and a distant bark from a wild animal. I hoped it was far away, but it was hard to tell. In reality, I was probably only out there for a few minutes, maybe 5 at the most, but it felt like an eternity. I felt completely alone in the world. Then, suddenly, the flashlights appeared out of nowhere, shining right at me. I was relieved. The teachers came back, and we all walked back to the campsite together. Our teachers were saying we were lucky that nothing strange happened this year. We joked around, and I guess I felt brave and grown up. The rest of the night was uneventful. The next day, I noticed my friend, who had done the dare around the same time as me, seemed really scared. She kept staring at the cliffs, and when I asked her what was wrong, she just said, "Can't you see them?" I looked at her, confused. "Look down there," she said, taking me to the edge of the field near the cliffs. When I looked down, I couldn't see anything. All I saw was a stream flowing below, but my friend looked like she was about to cry. She said she could see 2 kids down there, a boy and a girl, but I couldn't. She was shouting, saying there were kids with red faces down there. The teachers came over to check on her and try to calm her down, but just like me, they couldn't see what she was talking about. I was worried about my friend, but life on the campsite went on. Kids, as you know, have short attention spans, so we all eventually forgot about it. That night, I was very tired, but many of the other kids were still awake, talking and laughing. I was snuggled in my sleeping bag, about to fall asleep when I heard the tone of the conversation shift. The excitement turned into tension. I heard whispers, and when I poked my head out of my sleeping bag, I saw 2 girls leaning over a third girl, who was sitting on the floor, looking like she was in pain. "It hurts," she said, crying. She complained of feeling crushed, and right before our eyes, her body bent forward so much that her chin nearly touched the floor, like something heavy was pressing down on her. She screamed and cried, and everyone in the tent panicked. The tent was one of those large outdoor ones, and it all happened so fast. It was so chaotic and frightening. I had never heard anyone scream like that before. The teachers rushed in, one of them carrying a bottle of salt. They sprinkled it around and started patting the girl on the back. Miraculously, she stopped crying, got up, and was fine, like nothing had happened. After that, nothing else of note occurred. We went home without any more incidents. On the bus ride back, I talked with some of my friends and some other kids who weren't in our group about what happened. Some kids had different experiences. One of them said that when they went to the outhouse at night, they saw a kid they didn't recognize just standing there, staring at them. Other kids said they saw humanoid shadows moving around. I was really surprised to hear that so many of us had unusual experiences. The mountains are definitely an odd place. My friend, who had seen the kids with red faces, has been afraid of the mountains ever since that trip. I can't even remember why I wanted to go on that trip in the first place. It feels like a half-forgotten memory, like it was in some strange space between reality and dream. This took place many years ago during the fall when my parents told me we would be going on a camping trip. They said I could bring a friend along, and I was beyond excited. I knew it would be a fun experience. When the weekend finally arrived, my parents, my friend, and I drove up into the mountains. It was just a short, one-night trip, but it was more than enough for me. This happened back when camping wasn't as popular as it is now. When we got to the campsite, we were surprised to see that there were no other campers around. It felt a bit lonely at first, but I quickly shook that feeling off since I was just a kid. And to me, the campsite felt like our own private playground. We played by a nearby stream, explored the woods, and later that evening, we had a campfire and cooked up a barbecue. It was a blast. Just before bedtime, however, my friend's mood changed. Normally, he was full of confidence, but as soon as the sun set, he became quiet and seemed uneasy. Soon, with tears in his eyes, he told me he wanted to go home. By the time he asked, it was already too late. My parents had had a drink and we were getting ready for bed. We crawled into our sleeping bags, surrounded by the eerie sounds of the forest. The night was creepy, but we eventually managed to fall asleep without any issues. The next morning, we decided to head home early. We had planned to stay a bit longer, but my friend was clearly shaken, and it seemed like everyone just wanted to leave. We left before it even started to get light. I don't remember the exact time, but the sense of urgency was clear as we packed up and left. When we got home, it was still early, and my parents went upstairs, saying they were going to nap. I heard some noise from up there, but I didn't think much of it. Feeling exhausted, I sat down on the couch and fell asleep while watching cartoons. I woke up when the house phone rang. At the time, we didn't have caller IDs, so I had no idea who it was. I was hoping it might be my grandpa. My parents didn't come down to answer, so the phone just kept ringing, so I picked it up. "Hello, good morning," said a voice I didn't recognize. The person sounded close to my age, maybe a little older, and her voice was a bit youthful. The more I think about it, I wonder if it was actually someone older with a young-sounding voice. I didn't give my phone number to many people, so it was odd. I didn't say anything at first, just listening. The voice continued, "Camp was fun last night. The barbecue was really tasty, especially the shrimp. It was funny when your friend, who's usually so confident, started crying because he was homesick." I remained silent, still a bit sleepy but slowly becoming more awake. Something felt off and I began to get scared. There were only 4 of us at the campsite. How could someone else know all of that? I couldn't figure it out on my own, so I asked the voice, "How do you know all that?" There was a long silence on the other end, a silence that felt almost shocked. Then the voice answered, "Because we were together the entire time." The phone clicked, and the dial tone followed. I was absolutely freaked out, but my first thought was that it had to be my friend playing a prank. I called him right away, but he swore he hadn't told anyone about the camping trip, except his parents. He even told me he had been so embarrassed about his homesickness that he hadn't told anyone else. When my parents finally came downstairs, I asked them if they had given our number to anyone or told anyone about the trip. They assured me they hadn't. The only person they gave our number to was the one who reserved the campsite for us. In the end, I'm still not sure what happened. Part of me hopes it was just a prank, but there's a part of me that can't shake the feeling that someone was watching us that night in the woods. The last words I heard on the phone still haunt me, because we were together the entire time. Last winter, I went on a camping trip with a few coworkers. The campsite was on land owned by a relative of one of my colleagues, his uncle. The uncle had passed away some time ago, and the land had been left untouched, slowly becoming wilder each year. As soon as we arrived, my colleague mentioned that the area was tougher to navigate than he expected. There was a river, a steep hill, and dense woods surrounding the campsite in every direction. Felt completely isolated. We set up our tent near the riverbank. Some parts had gravel, but we found a decent spot. We built a fire and cooked dinner, enjoying the peaceful surroundings. The evening was calm as we sat around the fire, talking late into the night. Since the land belonged to my friend's late uncle, we didn't have to worry about disturbing anyone. As the night wore on, we began to wind down, and I was telling a story when I noticed that my colleagues weren't really paying attention to me. They seemed distracted, looking behind me, across the river. I turned to look and saw a shadowy figure on the opposite side of the river. It was hard to make out any details in the dark, but it looked like a person. The fire was the only light we had, so visibility was poor. The mood immediately changed. There was an uncomfortable tension as everyone started to get uneasy. The figure didn't belong there, and it felt like someone was watching us. We whispered about it, and soon the figure seemed to hear us. It vanished into the dark. My colleague stood up and said he needed to check things out. Without waiting, he crossed an old, rickety bridge over the river, heading into the darkness. He told us to stay by the campfire. I thought it was brave of him to go alone, especially since if he had waited a little while, we could have all gone together. But it was his family's land, so I figured he had the right to do so. Plus, the drinks we had shared earlier likely gave him some extra confidence. We heard his footsteps fade as he moved farther into the woods. The forest seemed alive with sounds, and it was hard to recapture the relaxed atmosphere we had before noticing the figure. After a few minutes, we heard footsteps again, and we thought he was returning to camp. But the sound changed direction, moving back into the woods. One of my colleagues called out, asking what he was doing, and then the footsteps turned into a sprint, heading deeper into the forest. It was eerie and unsettling. We were all a little shaken now, wondering where our friend had gone. More footsteps followed, and this time I grabbed an empty beer bottle, just in case we had to defend ourselves. But then I saw my colleague's face appear in the campfire light. He had returned and sat down with us. He said there was no one out there, maybe it was just a trick of the shadows. We told him about the footsteps we heard, and he seemed uneasy. Things were definitely getting strange. None of us wanted to stay there any longer, but no one was willing to be the first to suggest leaving. Then, more sounds came from the woods. Footsteps, rocks being thrown, and other unsettling noises. It was clear now, there were people out there and they didn't mean us any good. We packed up quickly and left. We never saw anyone, but whoever had been out there knew the land better than my colleague did. We never figured out what exactly happened, but I'm glad we didn't stick around to find out what would come next. Thank you. At the end of last summer, 2 friends and I decided to go camping by a nearby lake. We drove to the campground, set up our tents, and prepared dinner. Everything was going smoothly, and we were having a great time. We started a campfire and sat around it chatting for a while. It was still hours before we planned to sleep, so we passed the time talking about the lake, which was known to take several lives each year. Some locals claimed it was a place where people went to end their lives, while others believed the lake was dangerous because it had very deep, murky water, full of tangled weeds, tree limbs, and thick silt on the bottom that made it nearly impossible to escape. As we sat by the fire, we all noticed some strange lights across the lake. Since there were other campsites around the water, we assumed it was just another group camping. We didn't think much of it at first. However, after some time, I noticed the lights were growing bigger and brighter. We kept talking, but the lights drew our attention again. This time, they seemed to be moving toward us, growing brighter as they approached. The lights were moving much too quickly to be from a boat, and motorboats were prohibited on this lake. Before we knew it, the light was right at the edge of our campsite, and then it was directly overhead. It was as if we were slowly engulfed by the light. No matter which way I looked, all I could see was pure brightness. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. The whole thing lasted no more than 3 seconds. I clearly remember that my friends and I were sitting around the fire smoking before the light appeared. When the light was approaching, I saw my friend light a cigarette, but by the time the light passed, he dropped it because it had burned all the way down to the filter. It had burned his fingers, causing him pain. A fresh cigarette doesn't burn that fast in just 3 seconds. It was strange, but the weird part came after that. We realized we had no cigarettes left, as if they had vanished. The situation became even stranger when my friend, who had been burned, started screaming, not understanding what had just happened. His screams were the first thing I heard after the light had passed. I think I was in some sort of daze until that moment. When I looked around, I found myself standing knee-deep in the lake. My friend was also waist-deep, and our other friend was silently wading deeper into the lake. We screamed at him, but he didn't answer. We tried to reach him as quickly as we could, but it's hard to run in water. We were also sinking as we moved. I decided to swim instead, and the dirty water filled my mouth. I reached him first, since I was farther out in the lake, and I slapped him on the back and shook him until he came to his senses. None of us knew what had happened or how we ended up in the lake, but I'll tell you this. If my friend hadn't been smoking, things could have ended very differently. The lake is incredibly deep in the middle, and my friend was almost submerged to his chest. I shudder to think about what could have happened if we hadn't reached him in time. The possibility of drowning was very real. I still have nightmares about walking deeper and deeper into the dark, muddy water, unable to stop myself, watching the light above me fade as I sank lower and lower to the bottom. I now understand just how dangerous that lake is. I still don't know what that light was. Was it something paranormal or alien? I'll probably never find out. What I do know is that I'll never go back to that lake. We quickly got out of the water, dried off, packed up the car, and left, leaving most of our things behind. After that, nothing else happened, but that night still lingers in my mind.